And welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Today's the final day of the 2020 Democratic National Convention. Even though the proceedings have been virtual, we at The Hill have tried to make sure you're not missing out on any of the news and any of our juicy commentary. I've been getting my fix of politics from our daily events and our convention subs at thehill.com. This morning, we're going to go break down the speeches from last night and look ahead to tonight's main event, Joe Biden's speech, and his reveal of his plan to win in November. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the American Petroleum Institute, for its support of today's event. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at @TheHillEvents using the hashtag TheHill2020. We're live streaming. And as with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video, as we did yesterday. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem, unless, of course, your internet service provider lets you down. That's a long joke. We'll get to it another time. My first guest is Janet Murguia, President and CEO of Unidos US, the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. Janet, it's great to be with you. Thank you for joining us. So give us a snapshot. And let me do a little preamble here. I was watching your tweets, looking at your tweets, and you were talking about Hispanics making up the fabric of America. Nearly 1 in 5 people in the U.S. is Latino. And I'm, sort of interested in, you said, hey, can we have more representation? How do you think the DNC is doing on that front so far at this convention?
Oh, I think they're doing a great job. We did express some concerns early on when we heard about Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being limited to 60 seconds, the fact that presidential candidate, our Latino presidential candidate, Julian Castro, would not be in prime time. But it is undeniable that we have seen diversity, and Latinos and Latinas have been included in many different ways. And in some ways, it's notable the ways they have been included. We're no longer just the face of immigration issues. We have compelling stories, as you heard last night on immigration, but you also heard Latinas and Afro-Latinas talking about the environment and the importance of tracking global climate change and ending that. So for us, we're seeing a very diverse picture, a very powerful picture of stories and images, and a united picture among so many different peoples of color and generations. So it's been very impressive.
Earlier this week, I interviewed Julian Castro, and he sort of shared your comments. That he said, look, I had some concerns, he had out there been saying the Democratic Party could win this battle but lose the war-long run with the Hispanic community. And I talked with him a bit about what the Hispanic community in America needed to feel and see, what would be tangible by way of seeing the leadership that's trying to say it wants the White House. And he shared some ideas, but what do you feel, people, because this is a rah-rah time. It's easy to say anything out there, but the question is, what do they really need to feel and see as coming down the pike regarding their inclusion in this American democracy?
Well, obviously, these conventions are a template for how we see ourselves in the agenda, at the podium. But ultimately, you're right, Steve, what we need to see and hear are the commitments to the issues that we care about and solutions. Ultimately, it's really important for our community to understand that we can relate to these candidates and to their platforms, and that they represent our values, but also that they present a vision of which we're included in the future. And so for Latino voters, we've made it very clear. We want a president who understands the importance of diversity as part of the future of this country, and a person who will unite us as a country. And one other key trait we have as Latino voters is we want to elect someone who knows how to present solutions, who knows how to fix things, and will work in a bipartisan way to do so. Those are key traits for Latino voters that we've seen in our polls. So that's what we're looking for as we see the first sort of reveal in these conventions of who the candidates are and what they stand for.
Janet, what is the state of play from your community's point of view on DACA, Dreamers, the border issues? and basically inclusion in America. I mean, there's a whole roster of things. If you watch the conventions this week, all of these issues have come up, but they've come up amidst the blur of all the other agenda items. And so I'd love to get your state of play of what you think the key priorities are for Hispanics in America and how they fit from your perspective in the priority roster that the mothership of the Democratic Party has today.
Well, it's revealing that we have seen a real shift, I think, not just in the Democratic Party, but really across what the country, what the majority of Americans feel. And that is, they've made it pretty clear that ultimately they support dreamers. Ultimately, no one wants to see child separations, and no one wants to see children in cages. What that means is that there is a growing, overwhelming interest in comprehensive immigration reform and finally getting a solution to this. We've seen those elements embraced in this convention by the Democratic Party, which is something that before, Steve, you know this, immigration's been the third rail. I think what we're seeing is a shift here where there's a strong sense of and a consensus among the majority of American people, of course, among the Latino community and Latino voters. But finally, what we're seeing is coming together, a sense that we want a solution to this problem, and we can be compassionate, but we can also be sensible, and we should do what is in our country's interest, economically as well as consistent with our values. And that is, of course, we should allow for our dreamers to be able to remain in this country. They know no other country, and they already are contributing. And I think the COVID crisis, Steve, has reflected the role of Latinos, but also immigrants who are playing essential roles in the workforce. They're putting their lives on the line for this country to keep it fed and to keep it going and to care for so many. And what people are realizing that there is a sense of fairness here. And we ought to make sure that we're supporting those people who are supporting us. And so I think that has broadened a view of what fairness should dictate as we look at a path forward on immigration reform. And I think what we're seeing is that so many people are seeing that these individuals are already American in every sense of the word. And we ought to make sure that we have policies and ultimately laws that reflect that.
Janet, the Latino community has been hit really, really hard by COVID-19. In fact, I gave our condolences to Julian Castro. Julian and Joaquin lost their stepmother to COVID. That's happening all around the country. 170,000 people have died. How are the members of the Latino community going to vote? Are they going to trust the mail-in ballots? Are they going to show up at the polls? Are they in tune with this debate that's going on about the Postal Service?
Well, just to your point initially, that we have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. There's no question about it. We represent 1 out of 5 Americans in this country, and 1 out of 3 Latinos are now contracted the virus. Half of our community knows someone in their family who has contracted the virus, and yet we're in those essential roles. So obviously, we care deeply about someone being in place and in a leadership role to fix this. And we've not seen that level of competency or commitment by the Trump administration. So we're very concerned. And Latino voters remain concerned that Trump hasn't demonstrated the ability to fix this. But having said that, I think there's a clear challenge for us as we engage Latino voters to make sure that they're not victims of misinformation. Voter suppression efforts have been real in the past, and I think we've only seen the likelihood and already signs that there are efforts to provide those kinds of barriers, including the abuse or potential abuse of the post office by the executive office. We're seeing these steps being taken to limit hours and to take postal machines out of offices. That's unacceptable. And of course, we understand that it's important to support the bill that's been proposed in the House and to make sure that we can keep a fully functioning post office. I mean, Steve, you may know this from covering so many of the other economic issues, but Latinos rely singularly on the post office for medications, for checks, and for Social Security checks. We rely on Social Security singularly as an income in our elderly community. If the post office is undermined, you're talking about our economic viability being challenged. But of course, we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that Latino voters are aware of what they can do and steps they can take in order to vote by mail. We need to make sure that every voter, Latino and otherwise, understands that they shouldn't have to compromise their health to vote. I think there are going to be a number of efforts, including led by Unidos US, to educate voters and to do it in a way where they understand what the steps they can take to vote are and why it's important to consider voting by mail if they do feel that they can't be safe, and to vote early. So we've got a big voter education and mobilization campaign, the Adelante campaign that we at Unidos US are leading. And now voter suppression is a key element that we've integrated into that campaign because it's so important for our community to be fully informed. But we've seen tactics in my home state of Kansas, Dodge City in the last election, where you had Chris Kobach as the Secretary of State, try to move the only polling place outside the city, knowing how difficult it would be. And Dodge City is now about 45% Latino. So we're seeing real examples over and over again. We have to be vigilant, and we're going to do that at Unidos US to educate our Latino voters.
You know, Janet, we're going to need another hour because I was born in Kansas, and my good friend Michelle de la Isla at Topeka, mayor of Topeka, is out there running. And right now, we could go down the Kansas rabbit hole for a long time, but I'll try to resist. But listen, I know. Unidos is a nonpartisan organization, and there are Latino Democrats throughout governments in America, through Congress, Senate, and the same with Republicans. You've got Latino representation among Republicans. But this year, your PAC, the Unidos US Action Fund, did endorse Vice President Biden. Is there a shift? Because you haven't endorsed presidents in the past, as I understand it.
So I'm here, Steve, in my capacity as head of the Unidos US C3, the nonpartisan. And
not the PAC, right.
Not the PAC. So I can talk about our work to do voter education, voter registration, and mobilization. The PAC is and the Action Fund. Well, I have a role separate, and they have endorsed Joe Biden.
So I get the separation, but there is strong Latino representation in the Republican Party. We have a convention next week. Do you think they are carrying with them into that convention the agenda, the concerns, the issues about health, disparities, discrimination that you've just shared with us today?
I think it's regrettable because as we saw after the last election, there was an autopsy report. You may remember it was heralded. In fact, right. Michael Steele and others who led the Republican National Party talked about the major changes that the Republican Party needed to take and steps to engage Latino voters and Latina voters in the future. And there's a whole roadmap of ways that they could have done it and issues that they needed to focus on. They've done none of that. It feels like that autopsy report went straight into the trash. And unfortunately, we've only seen a hardening and a more extremism taken by this president and this administration when it comes to the issues that we know Latinos and Latinas care about, whether it's health care, whether it's the economy, and the ways that we've seen this president react and respond miserably to the COVID crisis and the failure to lead. That affects Latino voters' views more than anything right now. And if we can't see economic policies that are consistent with our interests and with the country's interests, it's really hard for us to see ourselves as part of that future of the Republican Party. Although you're right, Steve, we have, of course, Hispanics who are Republicans, but many of them, high-profile ones, have shared their disdain and they're just, they're heartsick about the way the party has turned, and many of them have walked away, at least for the course of this election cycle.
Well, I should add for our viewers that when we are doing these programs next week, the Republican National Convention, Michael Steele, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, will be among the stars that we interview and be there. I just heard from him yesterday, so I'll be sure to raise that autopsy report and the issues that you said. Let me just ask you, finally, and I know that I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment. We're friends, so I can do this. Joe Biden is going to give his big speech tonight. What would be a win for you, and what would be a flop?
Well, I think for us, seeing, I think, to be honest, we really feel that the convention and we worked with Vice President Biden, with Senator Biden. I think it's fair to say that we've seen on display an effort, especially this week by the convention, to reveal his values. A man who's decent, a man who's compassionate and empathetic. And I think last night we started to see more of a heavy lean into the policies. Tonight, it would be great to see this intersection of the values, but also the policies, the specific steps in which he's going to make sure that he builds back better. To live up to that phrase will be something that we'll all be looking for. And it has to be both, I think, a sense of style and values, but it also has to have some substance to it. And hopefully we'll see a lot of these issues that we've laid out and the way that he commits to rebuilding our country. And so we'll be looking for specifics around healthcare, around the economy, around housing and education, all technology, all of these. And of course, immigration reform. But all of these are issues that we care about as Latino voters, and we'll want to see his commitment to a plan to put America back on track.
Well, Janet Murguia, President and CEO of Unidos US, it's always a pleasure. And as I always hear from you, what I'm hearing is details matter. So we'll see. We'll be back to you. Thank you very much for joining us.